Greetings and welcome back. We're up to part 4 now, and I think it's going to be 5 parts, at least initially. If people are interested in this series, I can dive deeper into some of these things. But today we're going to talk about the battery testing that I do. And this is my battery test rig. Let me move that into frame there. What this is 3 circuits set up so that the first one drains 20 milliamps from the battery. The next one is 10, give or take. I couldn't get them exact, but I did make a record of how much they're actually drawing. So 20, 10, and 5. And then what I do is like right now, is currently running. It takes a while to run this, so I will get up in the morning, I will put batteries in, I will start tracking how long it takes from the turn off. This one is already turned off now. This particular battery is actually under retest because I've made some changes. I'll cover that in a moment. But this one lasted, I think, 4 hours. Let me see if I actually have, this is battery D. And this is my spreadsheet printed out. And D, yeah, it lasted 4 hours in what I call test rig. Basically, this started as something and it's evolved. So originally, this was the only one. I was calling it the test rig. It's a yellow light, which you can't see because it's off at this point. Then I had a blue, which I set up, which is actually this one over here. And then I added a green later on. And then after some issues, you can see I've got some yellow and some red in here. I ended up deciding I needed to make it more consistent. And one of the tough parts was figuring out how to determine how much power is being drawn out of each battery on each circuit, and then tweaking it to get to where I actually want to be. And I decided that 20, 10, and 5 was a good set of numbers. Because if you draw down a battery on 20 and then recharge it and then put it on the 10 and draw it down until it shuts off and then recharge it and then put it on the 5, and then you could do a weighted average of all of those numbers, it'll give you a pretty good idea of what kind of capacity the battery actually has. But that means I'm having to run each battery 3 times. If it only lasts 4 hours here, it might last 8 hours here, but that's not actually been what I'm finding. You would think at 20 milliamps versus 10 milliamps that it would last twice as long. But I think because it's a lower power draw, it's not heating up the battery as much, or some effect along those lines. But by having all 3 of these, I get a rough idea what the capacity of the battery is. And if nothing else, I have the capacity of the batteries relative to each other. So it may not be a perfect system, but it's what I'm using, and it does tend to help. If I have one of these solar garden lights that I'm working on, and I change out the LED, and I know that the LED is drawing more power than what's standard, then I can assume that I need a battery with more capacity for those particular ones. So that's the idea behind all of this. Let's look at the spreadsheet a little bit. This I've been doing for the past month or so. I've got 27 batteries in the pile, so to speak. A number of them are outside. I started this series with showing you the designs that I'm doing with the lights, and so you can see that I've got 30 lights out in the front yard. There's 26 batteries here. 27 batteries here. I've not tested everything in the front yard then. Some of them have not been tested yet. If they seem like they die quickly, when the lights come on in the evening, I can watch them, go look every hour or so and see which ones have gone out early, which ones go out first. And then I can basically pull those because they're no longer lit. I can pull them, I can bring them inside, and then the next day I can start by charging them up and testing the capacity and figuring out where I am. Or I can look at this as a reference because I put a letter on each one. This is D, this is U, and this is E. Making sure that it's actually in frame for you. So these are not in a particular order. It just happens to be the yellow ones here because I'm actually retesting these particular batteries. I thought I had the capacity right, and I was running into problems. So that's kind of what's going on with this. I also have battery chargers. It turns out that most of these batteries are so cheaply made, so poorly made, and I hate to be negative about things, but they're so poorly made that if you put them in a regular smart charger, it will reject them because it doesn't, a lot of them will be rejected because it just doesn't like the composition or whatever it's testing for. It's not up to spec. It's not meeting with its expectations. So I had to develop a dumb charger. And it's a very simple circuit, and if you're interested, I will go over that in the next episode. That's where I will tell you about the concept behind the design, and I will actually build a dumb charger. Suffice it to say, I've got some, because I've dealt with so many of these, I've got some of these where I just have the solar cell. This is not a good example. Let me grab a different one. These were actually Christmas lights, or the Christmas decoration kind of lights that I found at the dollar store. And then if you go after Christmas, although with the pandemic, I don't know if it's real smart. But if you go after, and as long as it's still got the battery connections in here, then you can actually develop in one of these. Let me see if I got another one that still has the contacts. No, well, I will figure that out in the next video. I will have that set up and ready to go, but you get the idea. I'm going to build, because I need to put the battery in something. So I need to have one of these that I can put the battery in. I've got another one over here that's I've had some problems with. The circuit has been soldered and desoldered and resoldered so many times that the traces are lifting up off of the board, so it's not really all that useful for that circuit, but I could maybe reuse this to build one. That said, let's also talk about, we've talked about my testing methodology. Some of these I will let run for 24 hours, and then basically the next morning I get up, and or the next morning at the same time that I started it, I'll call it 24 hours, and so you'll see a lot of these say 24 on here. That's just me ending the test at 24. It means that it probably has more capacity than it actually says, but that allows me to then put new batteries in and start another test. If I let them run, I basically also have to stay somewhere near this and check like every hour, and that gets to be a little crazy. And then maybe one of them runs out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I might be busy with something else. But if it runs out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I start it up and then it dies 12 hours later, that's 2 in the morning. That's not good. So just cutting it off at 24 hours, starting early in the morning, it all seems to work. You can see I've got a range. I'm hoping this is coming through on camera here. This first one is 75. I should say this column is the capacity of the batteries, but I've got some now that are under retest, so I've created another column for the retest, and that will have new numbers. So far, I've got 61.5 milliamp hours on D, which is actually one that's under test here. So far in testing, I'm only at 28.4, but that's because it lasted for 4 hours, and I'm only counting a third of that. So that's your weighted calculation. I have, where did I put the numbers? Actually, the numbers are not on this particular page. But these are not exactly 20, 10, and 5. If I take whatever this is, and whatever that is, and whatever that is, this times how long it lasted, this times, say 20 times how long this lasted, 10 times how long this lasted, plus 5 times however long this lasted, add them all together and divide by 3. That's your weighted average. And that's how I'm getting this 61.567 here. I've tested a lot, but I've got some that are still under test I haven't completed. and ultimately we'll see if the numbers change once I've retested. The earlier batteries, the one nearest the top, were before I refined my methods, so they may be inaccurate numbers, and that's why I refined it, because I was having some problems with the numbers not making sense, so I decided to do that. So let's, one more thing I wanted to talk about is how I can determine. It's tricky, because if you understand from previous episodes, the circuit here is effectively turning the light on and off thousands of times per second. That means that the power draw from the battery is not constant. It's actually kind of turning the battery, using the battery, and then not using the battery, and then using it again repeatedly. So it's a little tricky trying to figure out how much current's being drawn out of here. If I just simply put an ammeter here, let me actually grab a different one to give you, let me grab my test rig here. If I were to pull the battery part way out here and to get a meter and run between the positive and the contact here, in theory I should be able to see how much current's being drawn out of the battery. But like I said, it's being turned on and off, which makes that more difficult. What I finally came up with as a solution was to pull out, here it is, a special resistor. I mean, those of you that are into engineering might already know what this is, but this is a low tolerance resistor, not exactly mil spec, but most resistors have like a 5 or a 10% tolerance, meaning that if it was supposed to be 100 ohms, a 10% could be anywhere between 90 and 110 ohms. 10% more or less than what's actually stated by the color bands that are on here. That would be at 10%. At 5% it would go from 95 to 105. This one has a red band, which means 2%. So it's much closer, and then I actually use my meter to test the actual resistance of this resistor, which my meter is not perfect. No meter is perfect. Some are better than others. But ultimately it came right in on, actually this is 10 ohms, not 100. I put this in the circuit, and let me see if I can straighten out this leg. If I insert this into the circuit, now I can look at how much current is being drawn from this by testing the voltage across the battery, the voltage across the resistor. My apologies. I'm thinking about testing batteries. So what I'm going to do here is my power is coming in. My power comes in here, but what I'm actually going to do, let me move this resistor out of the way, is I'm going to pull this and move it over here so that I can actually run this resistor back to the LEDs and complete the circuit. Alright, jump cut, because that was a little difficult getting in because the legs are actually a thicker wire, but I got it in. So now the next thing I need is my meter. And I'm going to set that for volts. And what I can do now, because I know the value of the resistor, if I can find the voltage across the resistor, I can determine the actual current being drawn. And right now it looks like I'm getting, that right? Very little here. Looks like 8.2 millivolts. Right now it appears to be working, so let's go ahead and give that a shot. So I'm going to get one side. 0.235 volts. That makes more sense. That is 235 millivolts. divided by 10 ohms is going to be equal to 23.5 milliamps. That makes a little bit more sense. That means that this LED is drawing 23.5 milliamps. Now, that is with this LED plugged into the lowest value inductor that I have. I forget exactly what the value is, but it's like 0.1 millihenries. I'm going to go back to the 220 or 200-ish. That is standard in most of these that I've picked up. And that should also show that the current being drawn will drop. It is also a bit dimmer. So this should now have less millivolts, 75.5 we'll call it. So 75.5 millivolts divided by 10 is equal to 7.55 milliamps. So that should give you a good idea. Hopefully that's still somewhat in frame. Oh, you know what? I'm afraid it isn't. Let me see if I can't correct for that. We'll do one more. I'm going to move my test rig out of the way. Sorry, my capacity test rig. Now we're going to go with this test rig here, and we're going to look at, I'm going to move this out of the way for a moment, and I'm going to get the white LED that usually comes in these things. I'm going to plug that in. Of course, I got to get it the right way around. There it is. Settle it down. There you go. Now that's nice and bright, even at the 220, which is standard on that. And we'll bring the voltmeter back in. I'm going to measure across that resistor. And I am getting 55.6 millivolts, which, if I do the math, 55.6 millivolts divided by 10 ohms is going to be equal to 5.56 milliamps. So that is part of the reason why I've got all these different combinations of LEDs. I could throw something wild in there. Let me see if I can't. Let me try for actually a red LED just to demonstrate the difference. So the white was 5.56. I'm going to pull out a fresh red LED out of this package here, just so it doesn't get confused with the others. Now the package actually says it's supposed to be 20 milliamps. We might be able to drive it at less than 20 milliamps, but let's see what we get. I think this will be the right way around. There we go. Red LED is lit. Voltmeter. And we got 74 point, let's just call it 75. That's another thing, is that sometimes when you do it with this method is the number will climb or fall a little bit. So you have to just sort of estimate. I think it has to do with the fact that it's spiking so much. But if we call it 75 milliamps, I can already see what's happening here. And hopefully you can also see it too. 75 milliamps, millivolts, divided by 10 ohms. Are we still in frame here? Divided by 10 ohms is going to be equal to 7.5 milliamps. So the red is consuming 7.5, whereas the white was only consuming 5.5. And so that's why you've got to do the testing, and you've got to sort of understand some of this stuff in order to really be able to do anything beyond a very simple design. If you just simply want to swap colors, you can swap colors. But you can see that this is not a very bright LED right now, and that's because it's being underdriven. It's requiring more power than what the white LED required. And also the white LED is brighter for each little bit of power than the red is. Red is just a difficult color to get bright. I can switch the inductor and make this brighter. That is definitely brighter, but if I bring in the voltmeter one more time, I can promise you this is going to be more than 75 millivolts going across here. This is 200 and, we'll call it 200 millivolts. 0.200 volts is 200 millivolts. So 200 divided by 10 is going to be 20. So at that point, I'm driving it hard. It's pulling 20 milliamps, and all I'm getting for actual brightness, I'll turn off the lights, is that much. And I don't know if it's going to come through, if my camera is going to compensate for that. It is reasonably bright, but it's taking up 4 times as much power as that white LED, which means the battery is going to drain 4 times as fast. So if it lasts all night, let's say 16 hours in the winter, 16 hours on the white LED, it's only going to last 4 hours on the red LED. So you can see why I do all of this testing to try and figure out what the system is doing, what the circuits are doing, how I can tweak the circuits to match things up a little bit better. Do I need a more powerful battery? And then the last sort of question, which I haven't answered yet, and I may do in a future video, is how much power is being put back into the battery during the daytime when it's out in the sun. That is determined by where you locate it and how much sun you have in your region, whether it's a cloudy day or a sunny day. There are all sorts of things that affect it. And I'm just trying to at least understand from the discharging point of view how much I'm pulling out of the battery, and I can test the battery for capacity, and then I can see, once I make the combination that I think is going to work, does it at least stay on until, from dusk until, let's say, midnight? I mean, after midnight, you're not really wanting people to look at your display. You don't want them looking at your yard. So, but, if I could get them to last all night, then that means that the battery's not fully drained when morning comes and it starts recharging again. If it discharges before the end of the night, then it could continue to drain down even though you don't see a light. And it may be that the charging during the day isn't enough to keep up. And so even with a higher capacity battery, eventually it just won't turn on. So there's all these different things to consider, but this is my testing methodology. This is what I'm working with. And if you're interested in more videos beyond the last part where I'm going to talk about my dumb charger, please put a comment down below. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what you'd like to see, and we'll see what we can do together. And with that, I'll see you on the next episode.